Hundreds of scholarly works have been written about them, and military academies around the world still study their tactics today. Millions of people firmly believe that the Spartans, led by King Leonidas, were unmatched gods of war, capable of holding off entire armies on their own. Their reputation was so formidable that, according to Plutarch, enemies surrendered even before the battle began. But few realize that the famous complex phalanx maneuvers the Spartans are known for only started developing after their legendary stand at Thermopylae. Their fearsome status relied heavily on savvy publicity and a single heroic defeat. So why did this image take hold so deeply that it overshadowed the actual historical facts? And if even the greatest warriors of antiquity were shaped by propaganda, who then were truly the weakest fighters in history? To answer this question, we have to rewind over 3,000 years, back to a time when the entire Eastern Mediterranean world was literally falling apart. Around 1,200 years before the Common Era, something happened that historians call the Bronze Age collapse, a chain reaction disaster that wiped several civilizations off the map within just a few decades. The Hittites, Ugarit, and the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece all fell almost simultaneously. Trade routes that had carried bronze, tin, and grain for centuries suddenly went silent. Palaces, where scribes once kept records on clay tablets, turned into charred ruins. Greece entered what we call the Dark Ages. The population shrank dramatically. Writing was lost, completely lost. People forgot how to read and write. Centuries of technological progress vanished. It's like if the internet, electricity, and every book disappeared overnight, and a generation later, no one remembered how they worked. And so the Dorians descend from the north onto these ruins, nomadic shepherd tribes who arrived in Greece roughly 50 to 100 years after the Trojan War. They weren't conquerors in the usual sense, more like settlers claiming a land where no one was left to stop them. The Mycenaean kings were dead, their fortresses empty, their armies vanished. The Dorians took control of the southern Peloponnesian peninsula, settling along the Eurotas River Valley. 4 villages, dusty, poor, and without walls. Over time, these 4 settlements merged into a single polis, a city-state. Interestingly, the locals never called it Sparta. They identified as Lacedaemonians, after the city of Lacedaemon, marking their shields with the letter L. The name Sparta only became common much later, thanks to the Romans. Keep that in mind, the Romans would play a crucial role in shaping the Spartan myth. Here's the problem. 4 shepherd villages might come together to form a city, but that doesn't make them a state. At best, it's a group of people armed with weapons. To rule, you need legitimacy. In modern terms, a reason why everyone else must obey you. The local aristocracy found a brilliant solution. They claimed to be descendants of Heracles, the son of the supreme god Zeus. Not just lucky newcomers, but heirs of a demigod, returning to their rightful ancestral land. Essentially, they rebranded themselves, from rootless nomads into a divine dynasty. While neighboring Athens was slowly building civic institutions and laying the groundwork for what would become democracy, the Spartan elite took a completely different path. A rigid hierarchy bound together by the myth of divine blood. This is where a pivotal figure steps into the story. According to legend, a man named Lycurgus, whether a king, a regent, or simply a wise elder, crafted the Great Retra for the Spartans. This was an unwritten constitution, a set of laws designed to stabilize the state forever. Did Lycurgus actually exist? We don't know. Even the ancient Greeks debated whether he was a real person or a symbolic figure representing multiple reformers. But the impact of his reforms is undeniable. The Retra transformed a typical city-state into an ideological machine where every part of a citizen's life served a single purpose. The Constitution was intentionally unwritten. It couldn't be quoted, challenged, or rewritten. It lived only in minds and customs, and that's exactly why it was believed to last forever. But for the elite to dedicate their entire lives to the art of war, someone had to handle everything else. Farming the land, forging weapons, running the trade. and that's where the darker side of this story truly begins. Sparta's story begins with land, or more precisely, a lack of it. A small valley in Laconia couldn't support a growing population of warriors who neither plowed nor planted. Their solution was simple. Like a spear thrust, take what belonged to others. First, they conquered all of Laconia, the fertile lands nearby. Then, the Spartans crossed the towering Taygetus mountain range and invaded Messenia, a wealthy region to the west. This war lasted 19 years. It wasn't a quick raid or a punitive strike. Almost 2 decades of relentless battles fought for the right to own foreign land and foreign people. Here we need to pause and understand what Sparta did with the conquered people. Without this, the rest of the story doesn't make sense. They divided the subjugated population into 2 groups. The first were the perioikoi, literally those living around. They were technically free people, but had no political rights. They paid tribute and handled all the trade and crafts, everything from forging swords to tanning leather. Think of them as autonomous enclaves allowed to live and work, but forbidden from voting. The second group were the helots, state-owned serfs. Not personal slaves of any Spartan, but property of the polis, tied to the land. The helots plowed, sowed, harvested, and gave a fixed share to their Spartan masters. They couldn't leave, refuse, or complain. At the top of this pyramid stood the Spartiates, the true Spartans. They formed the ruling class, calling themselves equals. They owned the land and the helots, but never touched a plow, a hammer, or a set of trade scales. The perioikoi managed the economy. The helots produced the food. Meanwhile, the Spartiates did the one thing they were allowed to do: train for war. Every single day. From childhood until old age. Simply put, entire peoples existed so that a few thousand men could endlessly drill combat formations with their spears. During the same decades, Athens moved in the opposite direction, broadening citizens' rights, allowing merchants and craftsmen a say in government, and laying the groundwork for future democracy. Sparta, on the other hand, built a system where the freedom of a few depended on the enslavement of everyone else. Let's be clear about this. Behind Sparta's famed valor lay widespread slavery. It wasn't a side effect or a product of the times, it was the foundation. Without the helots, there would be no Spartiate warriors. Without the perioikoi, not a single sword would be forged. But even within this ruling class, trust was scarce. Sparta's political system functioned like a paranoid machine, where every cog kept its neighbor tightly in check. Let's start at the top. The state was ruled not by one, but 2 kings, a diarchy, a dual monarchy. Why 2? To prevent either from seizing absolute power. These 2 kings came from separate royal families and kept a close watch on each other, like 2 guards locked in the same room. But even the kings weren't truly free. Above them stood the Gerousia, a council of 28 elders, each at least 60 years old. This was essentially an oligarchic body, made up for life from the most powerful families. The Gerousia could propose laws, judge the kings, and even overturn decisions made by the People's Assembly. That assembly, the Apella, sounds almost democratic. All Spartan men over 30 gathered and voted. But they voted by shouting. The loudest voice won. And if the Gerousia felt the crowd voted the wrong way, they simply ignored the outcome. And finally, they added one more piece to this system. 5 ephors, elected overseers. These officials enforced the laws, handled foreign affairs, and held a power that probably made the kings shiver. Ephors could remove a king from power. They served only 1 year, meaning every 12 months, the balance of power could shift. 2 kings kept watch over each other. The Gerousia kept an eye on the kings. The ephors watched everyone. The Apella shouted its voice, but no one had to listen. No one in this system held absolute power, and no one ever felt truly safe. This entire structure, from the helots working the fields to the ephors in the council, aimed at one goal: to keep a few thousand men focused entirely on war. But to prevent this complex hierarchy from collapsing, the ruling class needed more than just laws. They needed people with a very different kind of mindset. They didn't find this psyche, they crafted it. The raw material was 7-year-old boys. At 7, not 10, not 12, but 7, they took the child from his mother's home and handed him over to the Agoge, a state-run system of upbringing with one clear surgical purpose: to erase individuality and forge absolute loyalty to Sparta. Not to parents, not to himself, to the state. The boy stopped being someone's son. He became a blank slate. This is where we need to pause and grasp the scale of it. 7 years old, that's an age when a child still struggles to tie his sandals, when he calls out for his mother at night, when the darkness scares him. At precisely that moment, they ripped him away from the only world he knew and threw him into a barracks, where the process of reprogramming began. The conditions in the Agoge weren't designed for learning. They aimed to break you down. Boys slept on reeds, torn barehanded from the banks of the Eurotas River. Not on mattresses, not on straw, on stiff stalks that pierced their skin and rotted by morning from the damp. They were fed just enough to stay hungry. Not because food was scarce, there was plenty. Hunger was part of the program. Boys were forced to steal food. Steal from other students, from adults, from anyone. And here's the paradox. They weren't punished for stealing. They were punished for getting caught. Getting caught meant you weren't clever enough, fast enough, or quiet enough. Then they beat you. Brutally, methodically, in front of everyone. The logic was as blunt as the club they used. Pain teaches better than any words. Endure it. Outsmart them. Don't get caught. Plutarch told the story of a boy who stole a fox cub and hid it under his cloak. When a guard approached, the boy stood perfectly still and silent, even as the fox tore into his stomach with its claws. The boy died, but never gave himself away. And this wasn't told as a tragedy. It was presented as a model to follow. After 11 years of such brutal training, you'd expect the Agoge to produce hardened, but still human individuals. But Sparta wasn't aiming for mere toughness. At 18, the best students faced the Sphacteria, a ritual with no turning back to humanity. They sent the young man out at night, alone, without armor, armed with only a knife. His target? The villages of the Helots. His mission? To find and kill the strongest, the most respected, those who might rise up in revolt. This wasn't war, not even an execution. It was a preemptive strike, murdering unarmed people in their own homes, in the dead of night, while they slept. A boy, taken from his mother at 7, at 18 had to slit a sleeping man's throat and return before dawn. If he came back, he had passed. If not, he was unworthy. More precisely, the Sphacteria served two purposes. First, to shatter the young man's internal resistance to killing. Second, to keep the Helots trapped in constant terror. It was like the government turned the final exam into a state-sanctioned purge. 2 goals in one. After the Agoge and the Sphacteria came the next phase, barracks life, where real military training finally replaced bare survival. And here, the key players weren't instructors or textbooks. The real bond was forged over shared meals, the Sphacteria. The Sphacteria was a brotherhood of about 15 or 16 warriors. They ate together, slept together, trained together, and fought side by side. Shoulder to shoulder in the phalanx stood not a stranger, but a man you had broken bread with every day for years. This connection ran deeper than any command. To flee the battlefield meant abandoning not some abstract homeland, but a specific comrade, Aristodemus, who just yesterday handed you the last piece of barley bread. At these meals, senior warriors passed down experience, tactics, and cunning, everything the Agoge never taught. The Sphacteria replaced family, completely, irrevocably. But even a seat at this table came with a price. Every member of the Brotherhood had to pay a monthly tribute in food: barley, cheese, wine, figs. If you couldn't pay, you got kicked out. And getting kicked out of the mess hall meant losing your status as a citizen. Not just a demotion, you ceased to exist as a full Spartan citizen. Everything hinged on how well your helots worked your land. A warrior who couldn't run his slaves efficiently stopped being a warrior. It was ironclad logic, in the most literal sense, because even money in Sparta was made of iron. Now, let's talk about what was on the table. The centerpiece of the communal meal? The black broth. It was made from pig's blood, chunks of meat, salt, and vinegar, all boiled together into a thick, dark stew. The smell was sharp and heavy, with a metallic tang that lingered on the tongue for hours. Other Greeks found this concoction so repulsive that, according to legend, a cook from Syracuse tried it and said, "Now I understand why Spartans don't fear death." But that was the point. Black broth wasn't meant to satisfy hunger. It existed to ensure the warrior never grew accustomed to comfort. Food was fuel. The body was a tool. Pleasure was the enemy. This assembly line turned boys into soldiers for generations. But here's the strange part. The system took 23 years to craft a single warrior, yet it never seemed to ask, what if there simply aren't enough warriors? Sparta poured everything into the quality of its men, but the state wasn't planning to rely on them alone. Spartan women owned property, not through their husbands, not through their fathers, directly. They didn't wash clothes, cook, or clean the house. The helots took care of all the domestic work. In Athens, Corinth, or Thebes, no woman had anything like that. Elsewhere in Greece, wives stayed in the women's quarters and rarely appeared before guests. But in Sparta, a woman managed her landholding while her husband lived in the barracks. It almost sounds like progress, almost like emancipation, 24 centuries before the word even existed. But the reason behind this freedom was purely practical. From a young age, girls trained in running, wrestling, discus, and javelin, not for competition, not for health, but for one purpose. A healthy mother gives birth to a strong warrior. A woman's body was just as much a state asset as a bronze shield or a plot of land with serfs. Rights weren't granted because women were seen as equals. They were granted to ensure the reproductive system worked more efficiently. In simple terms, the stronger the mother, the stronger the spear her child would grow into. Let's pause for a moment to tackle a common myth. You often hear that Spartan women were the most free in the ancient world. Technically, they did have more rights, but freedom means choosing what happens to your own body. Spartan women didn't get that choice. They trained to bear children. They were married off to bear children. And even if their husbands died, the state made sure they kept having children. That's not freedom. That's a function. Now, let's talk about the husband. A Spartan man could marry around the age of 20, but he wasn't allowed to live with his wife. Instead, he continued sleeping in the barracks with his comrades. Visiting his wife happened in secret, at night, under cover of darkness. This isn't a metaphor. Literally, the young husband would climb over a fence in the dark, like a teenager sneaking out of boarding school. Ancient writers tell us that some Spartans fathered children without ever seeing their wives in daylight. It wasn't until he turned 30 that a Spartan citizen gained full rights, receiving a land allotment with helots, earning the vote in the assembly, and finally being allowed to live with his family. Yet his military duty stretched on until he reached 60. But wait, if the state desperately needed warriors, and it did, then why keep husbands apart from their wives until they turned 30? Why shrink the window for having children? The system built to produce soldiers was actually getting in its own way, and the Spartans knew this. The solution they came up with is shocking, even by ancient standards. Because of a constant shortage of fighters, Sparta practiced shared wives, where, for example, two brothers would share one woman, not out of love or mutual agreement, but out of state necessity. Remember this, the shortage of people wasn't a random glitch. It was a chronic condition that would eat Sparta away from the inside. There was another type of bond, one the state not only allowed, but made an integral part of its system. The relationship between mentor and pupil. The older warrior and the adolescent had an intimate nature and was seen as a normal part of their education. It lasted until the student reached adulthood or got married. To modern ears, this sounds shocking, but it's important not to judge ancient people by 21st century standards. Such relationships existed throughout Greece. Sparta simply did what it did with everything else. It formalized them and put them to work for the army. The personal connection between mentor and student became a fighting bond. The person you shared your barracks, your meals, and your bed with, that was someone you would die for in the phalanx without hesitation. Try living just one day by Spartan rules. In the morning, you don't get your own breakfast, just a communal pot of blood stew. During the day, your task isn't your job, but marching drills. At night, you don't return to your home, but to the barracks. Your wife isn't really yours. Your child isn't truly yours. Even your money isn't money. Gold and silver coins were banned in Sparta. Instead, they used heavy iron bars, so bulky that hauling any meaningful amount needed a cart pulled by oxen. It's like getting a bag of bricks instead of a credit card. Building wealth? Physically impossible. Trading with other city-states? Pointless. Who would accept an iron bar in place of a gold drachma? With one stroke, Sparta erased corruption, luxury, and foreign trade. At the same time, it cut itself off from the rest of the world. Food, sex, marriage, children, money. There wasn't a single part of life the state hadn't turned into a military operation. This airtight machine seemed invincible, but soon it would face an army 200 times its size. 480 years before our time. The coast of Thessaly stretches out, darkened by more than 1,000 Persian ships on the horizon. On land, a massive army advances. Ancient sources estimate it at 200,000 soldiers. Herodotus's numbers are even wilder, but even if you cut them by 5, the scale remains staggering. Persian King Xerxes commands a force the small city-states had never seen before. 10 years earlier, at Marathon, the Persians were defeated without Spartan involvement. The Athenians bore the brunt of the battle. But this time, the threat was on a whole different level. The Spartans, led by King Leonidas, took charge of the united Greek land forces. Meanwhile, Athens prepared its fleet. 203 triremes, wooden warships with bronze rams. Two very different bets on one war. Sparta placed its faith in shield and spear, Athens in oar and sail. But first, how did the Spartans manage to hold back armies that outnumbered them by the dozens? The answer comes down to one word: phalanx. A tight battle formation up to 16 ranks deep, where each hoplite shields not only himself, but also the man to his right. A wall made of bronze, wood, and flesh. Every row presses against the back of the soldier in front. The first 3 rows thrust their spears forward. The rest push with their sheer weight. This isn't a duel, it's a squeeze, and no one can break through it alone. It only works when every person in the line makes the exact same move at the exact same moment. Step with the left foot, shield forward, spear down. Synchronization drilled into muscle memory. Other Greeks knew how to form a phalanx too, but they had fields to tend, workshops to run, families to care for. Spartans didn't plow the land, trade goods, or build structures. Others did all that for them. Slaves handled every physical task. Meanwhile, a Spartan started training at age 7, every single day, for a lifetime. So while a farmer from Corinth might pick up a spear once a season, a Spartan held his weapon non-stop for 20 years. The difference between an amateur and a professional lies in thousands of hours drilled into the body. And then this machine hit a bottleneck. Thermopylae, a narrow mountain pass just wide enough for a few wagons, squeezed between steep cliffs and the sea. 7,000 Greeks, led by Leonidas, stood here to block the path against an army 200,000 strong. Day 1. Xerxes sends wave after wave of infantry into the narrow pass. The Persians press forward, but the bottleneck is so tight that their numbers don't matter, like 100 people trying to squeeze through a single doorway at once. The Greek phalanx holds firm. Bronze clangs against bronze. The ground beneath their feet turns to mud, mixed with dust and blood. Persian bodies pile up against the shield wall, and more soldiers climb over them. Day 2. The same relentless assault continues. Xerxes deploys his elite, the Immortals, 10,000 of the empire's finest warriors. They too get pushed back. By nightfall, the pass is clogged with bodies, yet the Greeks remain standing. Leonidas probably realized by then this couldn't last forever, not because of exhaustion, but because of the people. A local named Ephialtes, according to Herodotus, revealed a hidden mountain path to the Persians. When scouts reported at night that the Persians were circling behind their position, everything became clear. The trap had snapped shut. Leonidas let the allies go. Most of the 7,000 soldiers withdrew. Only 300 Spartans remained, along with 1,100 hoplites from Thespia and other cities, plus an unknown number of helots, Spartan slaves, barely mentioned in the chronicles, treated like furniture. All of them died. Later, they carved an inscription where they fell. Simonides of Ceos, a poet, not a warrior, wrote 2 lines for them. "Traveler, go tell the Spartans at Lacedaemon that we lie here, obeying their laws, fallen in the dust." Those words outlasted everyone who read them. But here's the strange part. The war wasn't won at Thermopylae. Thermopylae was a defeat. A brilliant, heroic, legendary defeat, but a defeat nonetheless. The Persians broke through. They took Attica. They burned Athens. The real turning point came at sea. The Athenian navy crushed the Persian fleet in the Strait of Salamis. The following year, the combined Greek army finished off the remaining Persian forces at Plataea. The war was won by ships, strategy, and Athenian oarsmen, not by the last stand of 300. Yet what everyone remembers, 300. They remember Leonidas. They remember the pass, piled high with bodies, and the inscription on the stone. The beautiful sacrifice of a handful of warriors overshadowed the actual victory of an entire fleet. Historians know the name Themistocles, the Athenian commander who essentially saved Greece. But everyone knows the name Leonidas. 300 Spartans became the ultimate symbol of military valor. They set the standard for courage that no one has questioned, whether 100 years later, 1,000, or even 2,500 years on. Their story has become so deeply etched in stone that hardly anyone stops to ask, what was really happening inside the state that gave birth to these warriors? What price did they pay to keep the system running, one that produced people willing to die on command? The price was paranoia. To grasp its full scale, you need to look away from Sparta for a moment and gaze across the Corinthian Gulf, toward Athens. 2 city-states, 2 poles of the same civilization, yet complete opposites. Athens was a maritime trading powerhouse. Ships, ports, merchants from all over the Mediterranean. Sparta was a landlocked barracks, squeezed into the mountains of Laconia. In Athens, every free citizen had a real voice. They gathered at the Agora, the city's central square, to debate laws, budgets, war, and peace. They argued, voted, and could be elected to office. Spartans voted too, but with shouting. The ephors, the overseers, would step out to the crowd and announce a decision. Then the soldiers yelled their agreement or dissent. The loudest voice won. Even slavery differed between the two. An Athenian slave belonged to a specific owner, could save money, and, this is crucial, could buy their own freedom. In Sparta, that option didn't exist at all. And this is where things take a dark turn. The helots, the state-owned slaves of Sparta, didn't belong to individual people. They belonged to the state. Sparta assigned each full citizen, a spartiates, a plot of land along with the helot families who worked that land. The helots handed over half their harvest to their masters and kept the other half, which they could even sell at the market. On the surface, their conditions seemed milder than those of typical slaves. But the Spartiate couldn't sell his helots or set them free. If a warrior failed to fulfill his military duties, the state seized both his land and his helots. These slaves weren't private property. They were state assets, like weapons or a barracks bed. And that fact changed everything. Because the amount of state property was 30 times greater than the number of owners, 9 to 10,000 Spartan citizens stood against 2 to 300,000 helots. To put it in everyday terms, all the full citizens of Greece's most powerful military state could fit inside a single stadium. Meanwhile, their slaves filled what would amount to a small town. For every warrior, there were about 30 people who hated him. Frequent uprisings by the helots weren't just a distant threat, they were a brutal routine. These rebellions flared up regularly, and crushing them demanded every resource Sparta had. Pause for a moment and consider what this meant in daily life. Every night, you'd go to bed knowing dozens of people waited just outside your walls for the right moment. Each morning, you'd wake up and check if a revolt had already begun. Every time you left Laconia, you risked the danger that while your army was away, your home might erupt in flames. And the Spartans found a solution, or at least what they believed was a solution. The Sphacteria was a secret police force made up of young warriors. Every year, Sparta officially declared war on its own slaves. Not metaphorically, they literally issued a formal declaration of war. This allowed them to kill helots without breaking religious laws. Killing without a declaration was considered a sacrilege. The gods would punish them. But with a declaration, it was perfectly legal. Young Spartans would go out at night, hunt down the strongest, most visible helots, and kill them. It was a preventive measure to stop any leaders from rising among the slaves. But terror alone wasn't enough. They needed an ideology. State propaganda painted the helots as less than human, creatures beneath even animals. The helots were forced to drink themselves into a stupor, then paraded in front of Spartan children. Look, they were told, this is what a slave is. This is his nature. He's not human. He's a beast, incapable of self-control. The children grew up with that image burned into their minds. They became warriors who truly believed that the 30 men behind the wall were not people. The system worked. But Sparta paid a heavy price for it every single day. The army that all of ancient Greece believed to be unbeatable actually couldn't leave its own territory. The land Sparta controlled was only as large as a few modern Londons put together, and even holding on to this small patch stretched their forces thin. Any campaign far from home meant weakening the garrison. A weaker garrison invited rebellion. Rebellion meant disaster. Sparta feared conquest, not because it lacked the will, but because it simply couldn't afford to take that risk. The picture is puzzling. Here's a state whose entire culture revolves around war, whose citizens do nothing but train for battle from the age of 7, yet this state lives paralyzed by fear of its own servants. The greatest warriors of antiquity didn't sleep easy, not because they were sharpening their swords, but because behind every wall sat 30 reasons not to stray far from home. And deep within that system, something was already ticking. Decades later, the ground beneath Sparta would literally tremble, and everything built on fear would crumble all at once. Let's start with the most famous phrase. Come and take them, or molon labe, is what King Leonidas supposedly shouted at the Persians when they demanded the Spartans surrender their weapons. You'll find these words printed on t-shirts, tattooed on biceps, and stamped on military dog tags all around the world. But here's the catch. This phrase was recorded by Plutarch, a writer who lived 500 years after the Battle of Thermopylae. 500 years. That's like someone today claiming to have the exact words Christopher Columbus said and insisting it's authentic. We don't actually know if Leonidas ever said those words. Chances are, he didn't. Since we've started examining the showcase, let's take a look at another exhibit. The idea that weak infants were thrown off cliffs is one everyone knows, from movies and textbooks alike. But here's the catch. Archaeologists digging at the foot of the mountains in Laconia found skeletons. Not of children. These were adults, executed criminals. There simply aren't any infant bones there. The myth of discarding newborns holds up only in text written by outsiders centuries later. Now let's talk about Sparta's military reputation. During the first Persian invasion, when the Persians landed at Marathon, Athens sent a messenger to Sparta asking for help. Sparta refused. The reason? A religious festival. They believed they couldn't march to war before the full moon. Athens defeated the Persians on their own, without Spartan aid. So, who got the glory as defenders of Greece? You guessed it. In reality, the entire image of unbeatable warriors grew from just one decision. Not from some unique combat skill. Leonidas' choice to fight to the last man at Thermopylae. That's what built the reputation of the gods of war. This act overshadowed the achievements of other Greeks fighting alongside him. And here's the twist. The Spartans developed their more complex phalanx maneuvers only after becoming famous at Thermopylae. Skill didn't create their fame. Their fame drove them to develop skill. Cause and effect flipped on their head. But hold on. If their reputation was so blown out of proportion, maybe they at least won more often on the battlefield? Historian Brett Devereaux did the math. 40 documented battles involving Spartans. Their win-loss record? Almost 50-50. More precisely, 48% victories. Less than half. These elite warriors who trained for battle from the age of 7 actually lost more often than they won. So how did they maintain their status in the first place? Plutarch provides the answer. The Spartans' reputation alone often shattered enemy morale before the battle even began. Opponents trembled at the sight of those red cloaks, at the steady, rhythmic march of the phalanx. Sparta's greatest weapon wasn't the sword or spear. It was pure psychological warfare, a carefully crafted legend that took on a life of its own. But when the enemy didn't flinch, trouble followed. After the Persians were defeated, two dominant powers emerged in Greece, Athens and Sparta. A clash between them was inevitable. In 464 years before our era, a massive earthquake struck Sparta. The Helots rose up in rebellion. The Spartans called on Athens for help, but when the Athenian force arrived, Sparta sent them right back, suspecting they sympathized with the rebels. From that moment, the tension between the city-states became unstoppable. The Peloponnesian War exposed what Sparta's reputation had long concealed. Spartans didn't know how to storm cities. They couldn't build siege engines. Fighting outside the tight phalanx formation? That was beyond them. Their entire training focused on one thing: open field battles. Any other scenario left them stuck. Meanwhile, Athens was building its navy, trading, adapting. Then came the year 425 BC. On the island of Sphacteria, 120 Spartan warriors found themselves surrounded. These were soldiers the entire Greek world believed would rather die than surrender. Yet, they gave up. Voluntarily. The whole of Greece was stunned. When asked why they hadn't fought to the bitter end, one prisoner simply said, "Arrows don't care who's brave." Throughout Spartan history, only one general truly achieved significant success. And he did it by breaking every rule of their system. Brasidas was the man who once lost his shield in battle, a disgrace by Spartan standards, the worst shame possible. But instead of breaking down, he learned from it. He turned his mistakes into lessons, a rare quality for a Spartan. Brasidas raised his own army, promising freedom to the Helots in exchange for military service. He didn't treat them like expendable resources. Instead, he trusted them as full-fledged soldiers. Rather than charging headfirst, he relied on cunning and diplomacy, offering cities peaceful terms of surrender. He brought more benefit to Sparta than even Leonidas. And he, too, died in battle. But Brasidas never became famous. His story lives on partly through the game Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and that might be the most recognition he's received in over 2,500 years. You might think that after such a general, Sparta would have reconsidered its approach. But no, Sparta defeated Athens in 404 BC. The catch? It didn't win by its own strength. It won with Persian money, which funded the fleet. Their former enemy bankrolled their triumph. Then came a chain reaction. Persian gold flooded into Sparta. Loot from sacked Athens followed. A system built on strict austerity suddenly collided with wealth. Corruption ate away at the elite from within. Sparta's dominance lasted only a few decades. And most importantly, the Spartan citizens were dying out. Around 500 BC, there were between 8 and 9,000 of them. By 371 BC, fewer than 1,000 remained. If this story lasted an hour, 51 minutes would be about the Helots and their suffering. 6 minutes would cover trade by the perioikoi, the free non-citizens, and only 3 minutes would focus on the Spartans themselves. That's how few were left. 371 years before our era, the Battle of Leuctra. The Theban commander Epaminondas arranges his phalanx in an oblique wedge and strikes the strongest Spartan flank, the one holding their elite forces. Of the 700 Spartans who marched onto the field, only 300 survived. Sparta, as a military power, ceased to exist. The laws of Lycurgus, the unwritten constitution that once forged Spartan strength, became the cause of its downfall. They blocked any chance to adapt. They shut out new citizens. They forbade economic change. The system was built for a small military camp, not for running a state. And when reality demanded flexibility, Sparta responded with the only thing it knew: rigidity. That rigidity buried it. Here's what remains after all the numbers and facts are laid out. A state the world remembers as the ultimate symbol of military valor actually lost more battles than it won. It surrendered, defeated its main rival using other people's resources, and eventually vanished because it couldn't change its own rules. Yet the myth somehow survived. And that might be the strangest part of the entire story. In 146 BC, Roman legions marched into a city that had lost its influence 2 centuries earlier. Sparta, once a great power, had become a second-rate polis, stripped of its army, allies, and wealth. The Romans didn't even have to storm the walls. After all, Sparta had no walls. Real warriors supposedly had no need for them. The conquest unfolded so quietly that ancient historians summed it up in just a few lines. But what happened next proved far more intriguing than the conquest itself. The Romans, captivated by the city's legendary past, chose not to tear it down or rebuild it. Instead, they turned Sparta into a theme park, literally. The locals, descendants of those once invincible warriors, performed brutal ancient rituals for Roman tourists, all for a fee. Public floggings of young men at the altar of Artemis, once a core part of Spartan education, became paid entertainment for visiting nobility. It's like turning Buchenwald into an amusement park, with actors dressed in striped uniforms. But in ancient times, no one batted an eye. The great military machine ended its days at the ticket booth, and this is where a mechanism begins, one that still runs today. The Spartans left behind no historical texts of their own, no chronicles, no memoirs, no philosophical treatises. Everything we know about Sparta was written by outsiders, Athenians who either hated them or admired them, enemies and fans. There was no third option. A French scholar named François Ollier called this the Spartan mirage, when a real state is completely replaced by its ideological reflection in foreign writings. Here's a crucial idea that goes beyond ancient history. If you don't write your own story, you're doomed to become a character in someone else's. The Spartans despised words, and words buried them. By the way, the word laconic comes from Laconia, the region of Sparta. The Spartans took pride in brevity. The irony is that this very brevity, their refusal to explain, record, or argue, turned them into a blank canvas. Anyone could paint whatever they wanted on it, and they did, for centuries. Adolf Hitler saw the Spartans as proof of racial superiority. To him, they represented a blueprint for conquering Eastern lands, where Slavs would be reduced to helots, slaves serving the Aryan elite. Meanwhile, communists admired Sparta for its absence of private property and the total state control over citizens' lives. The same Sparta, both a Nazi ideal and a communist utopia. At the same time. How is that possible? Quite simply, when the original is missing, everyone sees themselves in the mirror. America's story is even more fascinating. In its early days, the United States identified itself with a new Sparta, a conservative, agrarian republic standing against the Athens of the time, the British Maritime Trading Empire. But a century and a half later, the Cold War flipped that metaphor completely. Suddenly, America became Athens, a democracy and naval superpower, while the Soviet Union took on the role of the new Sparta, an authoritarian land power. The same image, two opposing meanings, and just a few generations apart. Today, American soldiers wear patches featuring the Spartan lambda on their uniforms. Spartans are portrayed as defenders of the free West against an aggressive East. Yet, the real Sparta was a slave-owning police state where barely 5% of the population enjoyed freedom. But who cares when a Greek helmet looks so striking on a patch? Modern historians still can't agree. Some compare Sparta to North Korea, a closed, militaristic society built on fear and propaganda. Others call for more measured judgments and deeper research, warning against imposing today's values on the ancient world. And really, these views don't have to contradict each other. Instead, they highlight just how little we truly know. Now, let's set all that aside. Suppose Sparta really was the greatest military power of the ancient world. What difference does that make to your Monday? Will you become stronger just because your phone wallpaper shows a Spartan helmet? Probably not. But here's what's worth taking from this story. Not the facts about phalanxes or helots, but a skill. The skill to ask one simple question. Who wrote this, and why? The best way to debunk any myth isn't just to pile on counter-arguments. It's to understand why people benefit from believing it. Hitler needed a model of racial supremacy. He found it in Sparta. Communists wanted an example of collective ownership. They found it there too. American generals looked for a symbol of military valor. They saw it in those same 300 Spartans. Sparta isn't to blame. Sparta has been dead for a long time. Only those who use its name still live on. This state, remembered worldwide as the standard of strength, turned out to be the weakest in the one battle that truly mattered, the battle for its own story. It lost because it never showed up, and into the empty space stepped those who valued borrowed glory more than the truth. What other so-called timeless truths surrounding us every day will, upon closer look, reveal themselves as nothing more than a clever brand, one that outlived its creator?